the spark that lit the fire, Stonewall. Pride Month didn't begin with parades, brand sponsorships, or rainbow flags. It began with a riot. The year was 1969, and being gay in America was still criminalized, pathologized, and violently policed. Queer people were routinely harassed, arrested, and institutionalized simply for existing. In New York City, the Stonewall Inn was one of the few places where LGBTQ+ people could gather. Not safely, but at least together. The bar, located in Greenwich Village, was owned by the mafia, served watered-down drinks, and regularly paid off the police. But for the queer community, especially those rejected by society, drag queens, trans women, sex workers, homeless youth, it was one of the only places to go. In the early hours of June 28, 1969, police once again raided the bar, but this time, the community fought back. People refused to be arrested. They threw bricks, bottles, and whatever they could find. Crowds grew. Tensions exploded. The resistance lasted several nights, transforming the streets outside Stonewall into a battleground. This wasn't the first time queer people had resisted, but it was a moment that couldn't be ignored. The media tried to dismiss it as chaos, but for those who were there, it felt like a line had been crossed. The movement had found its spark. Figures like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, two trans women of color, became symbols of that resistance, though their roles were often downplayed or erased in later retellings. What happened at Stonewall wasn't polished or perfect. It was messy, angry, and necessary. It was the moment queer people stopped apologizing and started demanding. And it was only the beginning. Before Stonewall, the forgotten rebels. To understand the explosion at Stonewall, you have to look at the slow burn that came before it. The 1969 riots didn't erupt from nowhere. They were the result of decades of quiet resistance, forgotten protests, and invisible pain. In the 1950s, while America sold a vision of suburban perfection, queer people were being purged from government jobs in what became known as the Lavender Scare. Thousands were accused, interrogated, and fired simply for being suspected of homosexuality. It was a witch hunt wrapped in patriotism. But even under that pressure, early LGBTQ+ activists began to organize. The Mattachine Society, founded in 1950 by Harry Hay, was one of the first gay rights groups in the United States. It was followed by the Daughters of Bilitis, a lesbian organization founded in 1955, which offered support and education at a time when simply gathering in public could lead to arrest. These groups were cautious, careful, and deeply strategic, often promoting assimilation to avoid provoking authorities. Yet, they were radical in their mere existence. In the 1960s, as civil rights and anti-war protests dominated headlines, some queer activists began to push louder. They staged sip-ins, modeled after civil rights sit-ins, challenging bars that refused to serve openly gay patrons. They organized pickets at the White House, dressed in suits and dresses, holding signs that demanded dignity. They weren't celebrated. They were ignored, mocked, and even attacked by fellow progressives. But they laid the groundwork. They built networks, raised consciousness, and proved that queer people could fight back. So, when Stonewall happened, it wasn't the start of a movement. It was a breaking point. The first prides, marching through fear. In the wake of Stonewall, something changed. The riots didn't just spark outrage, they ignited organization. Within weeks, activists formed the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activists Alliance, and a host of other groups determined to seize this new momentum. They weren't asking politely anymore. They were demanding to be seen, to be heard, and to be free. 1 year later, on June 28, 1970, hundreds of people gathered in New York City to commemorate the anniversary of Stonewall. They called it the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. No one had ever done anything like it. There were no floats, no music, no corporate sponsors, just a line of people walking through Manhattan, holding signs, chanting, and looking over their shoulders. Fear hung in the air. But as they moved through the city, something remarkable happened. The crowd grew. Strangers joined in. Applause erupted from windows above. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen other people like them. That march marked the beginning of what we now call Pride. In 1971, marches spread to other cities: Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, Chicago. Each one a fragile, defiant act of visibility. And every person who showed up knew they were taking a risk. Marching wasn't safe, but neither was staying silent.
But there's enough of us that don't have to be afraid that we'll carry the load for the ones that have to be.
Pride in the shadow of AIDS. By the 1980s, Pride had grown. What began as marches of a few hundred had turned into parades of thousands. But just as the LGBTQ+ community began to step into the light, a devastating darkness fell. The first whispers came in 1981. Young gay men in New York and California, dying of rare cancers and pneumonias that doctors didn't understand. At first, it wasn't even called AIDS. It was referred to as the gay cancer, a name that revealed more about prejudice than science.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine.
As the crisis grew, so did the stigma. The media ignored it. The government stayed silent. President Ronald Reagan didn't even mention AIDS publicly until thousands had already died. Funeral homes refused to bury the dead. Hospitals turned away patients. Entire communities were abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them. And yet, in the face of terror, pride became something more powerful. It became a platform. It became a scream. Groups like ACT UP and the Gay Men's Health Crisis emerged, staging die-ins, demanding medication access, and forcing the world to pay attention. Marchers carried photographs of lovers and friends. Quilts stitched with names lined the streets. Silence equaled death, and silence was no longer an option. Corporate pride, rainbow or red flag. As the AIDS crisis faded from daily headlines in the 1990s, a different kind of visibility emerged. Pride events were no longer confined to the fringes. They were inching their way into the mainstream. Cities like New York, San Francisco, and London began closing down major streets for their parades. Media coverage became less hostile. And then came something no one expected: corporate interest. First, it was just a few sponsors. Local banks, progressive bookstores, maybe a newspaper. But soon, global brands took notice. Rainbow flags began appearing in storefronts. Companies marched with branded floats. Big money entered the scene. And with it came a wave of slick marketing. For many LGBTQ+ people, it felt like a long overdue sign of progress. But not everyone was celebrating. Critics began to question what was being lost in the process. Had pride become too safe, too sanitized, too commercial? Voices from within the community accused major corporations of rainbow washing, publicly supporting LGBT+ rights during June, while quietly donating to anti-gay politicians or avoiding real change internally. Others worried that the radical roots of the movement were being erased in favor of sponsorship deals and marketability. Corporate pride raised uncomfortable questions. Is visibility enough? Who benefits from it? And at what cost does a movement become a brand? Global pride, a tale of two worlds. While pride celebrations were growing louder in the West, a very different story was unfolding across the globe. In some countries, being LGBTQ+ didn't just come with social stigma. It came with the threat of imprisonment, violence, even death. As rainbow flags waved in New York and London, people in places like Russia, Uganda, and Saudi Arabia were being beaten, arrested, or driven into hiding simply for existing. In Russia, activists tried for years to hold pride marches, only to be met with bans, police brutality, and violent counter-protests. In Uganda, where homosexuality remains criminalized, the government has passed laws threatening life imprisonment for aggravated homosexuality.
When you commit aggravated homosexuality, the law says you shall be liable to suffer death.
In places like Chechnya, reports have emerged of gay men being abducted, tortured, and disappeared in what human rights groups have called a purge. And yet, even under these conditions, people resist. Underground pride events are held in secret. For those living under oppressive regimes, pride isn't about celebration. It's about survival. It's a reminder that while progress has been made in some parts of the world, others are still fighting for the basic right to exist. And too often, they're fighting alone. Trans voices in the fight. From the very beginning, trans people have been on the front lines of LGBTQ+ resistance. Yet their contributions have too often been ignored, erased, or downplayed. The Stonewall riots are frequently celebrated as the spark of the modern pride movement, but the names most commonly remembered are still not the ones who threw the first punches or stood tallest in the face of danger. Marsha P. Johnson, a black trans woman, and Sylvia Rivera, a Latina trans activist, were not just participants in the riots. They were symbols of defiance in a world that consistently tried to push them aside. Yet even as pride parades grew and queer visibility increased, trans people were left behind. While cisgender gay men and lesbians were gradually gaining rights and representation, trans people were still fighting for recognition, basic health care, and safety. Pride, for many trans people, became a space of both empowerment and alienation, a movement they helped build but were often shut out from. In the 2000s and 2010s, a wave of trans visibility began to shift the conversation. Public figures like Laverne Cox and Janet Mock brought trans experiences into the mainstream, but visibility brought its own risks. Trans people, particularly trans women of color, continued to face disproportionately high rates of violence, homelessness, and unemployment. In many parts of the world, those statistics remain unchanged. The backlash has been brutal. Bathroom bills, bans on gender-affirming care, and waves of online harassment. And yet trans activists continue to push forward, reminding the world that Pride without trans-liberation is not pride at all. Pride backlash, the culture war today.
We are in a battle right now between truth and pride.
For all the visibility, progress, and mainstream acceptance Pride has achieved over the decades, it now finds itself at the center of a renewed culture war. In recent years, a wave of anti-LGBTQ+ sentiment has surged across political and social landscapes, often disguised as concern for children, parents' rights, or religious freedom. Laws have been passed across the United States banning books with LGBTQ+ characters from school libraries. Drag shows, once a staple of Pride celebrations, have been targeted by legislation, with performers facing threats, arrests, and public harassment. In Florida, the so-called "Don't Say Gay" law prohibited discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in classrooms, setting off a domino effect of similar laws across conservative states. Pride flags have been burned, events have been canceled due to safety concerns. Protesters have returned to Pride marches not with signs of solidarity, but with slurs and threats. Online, the backlash has become even more vicious. Influencers and politicians have capitalized on outrage, painting Pride not as a celebration of identity, but as a political threat to so-called traditional values.
Pride means something like stubborn refusal to change when evidence of error is accruing. And it's not a good thing.
The very existence of LGBTQ+ people, especially trans youth, has been weaponized in the fight for votes, headlines, and cultural dominance. In this climate, Pride has become more than just a party or protest. It's a battlefield. And for many, showing up to a Pride event today feels like returning to the roots of the movement, not just to celebrate, but to resist. Because behind the glitter and music, the reality is simple. There are powerful forces working to push queer people back into silence. And the only way to stop them is to keep showing up, louder than ever. What Pride really means. Pride Month is many things. A celebration, a protest, a memorial, and a lifeline. Pride is rooted in defiance. It was born from violence, from injustice, from a refusal to be erased. It's not just about identity, it's about survival. And that story isn't over. Today, Pride exists in two realities. One where queer people are celebrated, and one where they're still hunted. In some places, it's a parade. In others, it's an act of rebellion. The danger hasn't disappeared, it's just changed form. And while progress has been made, it remains fragile. Rights can be taken, acceptance can be revoked. So, what does Pride really mean? It means remembering where this began. It means honoring the people who never got to see the world they dreamed of. It means showing up, not just in June, but every time someone tries to push you back into the closet. It means protecting the most vulnerable members of the community. Pride is not a brand, it's not a party, it's not a trend. It's a promise that no matter how loud the world tries to shout us down, we will not be quiet, we will not be erased, and we will never stop fighting to be free.